Thank you very much, Sean, for a fantastic talk that managed to go from Aristophanes to Dante to Bo Diddley, if I recall. Really amazing to hear you speak from your experience in the theater as a poet, as a translator, and really a broad-ranging talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'm just going to ask a couple of questions, and then I would like to throw open the floor to questions from the audience as well, but I'll give everybody a few minutes to gather their thoughts. You spoke quite at length about the distinction between translation as a pure or virtuous activity versus something that seems more a practical, get your hands dirty intervention. And did you arrive at that by hard work, that idea, or was it a natural way for you to think about translation?
It just, the conviction gradually grew on me, I think, that whilst for some purposes accuracy is everything, for the purposes of certain kinds of learning, accuracy is everything. For the purposes of reading, for the purposes of the imagination, it's only part of the story. That somehow you have to impart a certain friction to the material as it comes into the language in order to sustain its movement, I think.
Yeah, you talked a lot about the translation, the poem needing to live as a poem to sustain its momentum and its activity.
Yes, I recently read, and some of you have undoubtedly read, Munisa Alvi's versions from Jules Supervielle, which Blood Axe recently published, and I think some of them work extremely well. But there are problems when the original poem is as uninvested in the concrete as some of Supervielle's work seems to be. Stand open to correction on any of this, but it just seems to me that English is so wedded to particularity, concreteness, hard edges, friction, that something which is more impalpable is very difficult to render. And that seems to be a case where some sort of intervention is called for. And I noticed that Munisa's translation is definitely versions. She uses different forms, she lengthens, she shortens poems and so on. I think if you want the thing to live, you carry report of it rather than delivering its corpse, to the stage. I'm sorry, that was rather unfortunately expressed.
No, not at all. I think you were talking earlier about the unhappy hybrid of perhaps some translations you've read where the language is neither that of the source text or source language nor the target language. It's something indeterminate and therefore quite a failure. Do you have anything to say further on that?
Well, no, but I think it's to do with the ideas of respectability, that such a translation is made out of respect, but respect applied in slightly the wrong direction, of wishing to be, in some way, of wishing not to be impugned by the original, and that can have a deadening effect.
Yeah, well, it comes back to your comment earlier in your talk about whom is the translator serving, right? Where is the responsibility, I suppose. Yeah, and you did say at one point, mistakes will occasionally happen, so shoot me. And I was wondering whether you had any examples. Has somebody played gotcha with you?
Yeah, well, the current thing I'm working on, I have the Kathleen Jeffs, who supplied the literal, immensely detailed, very, very helpful notes, has now been over the draft and said, the emphasis in this line is wrong. You're putting the cart before the horse. It's faith rather than works. It's not in this order. What do you want doesn't mean what do you want. It means what do you hope for. The matters of emphasis. Yes, I find that kind of instruction very helpful.
Exactly. Fantastic. I'd love to open the floor. Wonder if we could get a little bit more light up on the audience, if at all possible. Yeah, thank you. And who would like to ask a question of our speaker, Sean O'Brien, this evening? Yes, Adriana, please.
Have you worked with...
Oh, here's the microphone for you, if you don't mind waiting.
Have you worked on work by living poets, and when you've taken the liberty to, when the work has suggested something to you and you've wanted to go off on one, so to speak, has an original author ever said, oh, no, you can't do that, that's not where I was going?
Yeah, I see what you mean. Well, in the case of Corsino Fortes, he is living, but extremely difficult to say with absolute confidence what there is. So you have to go on instinct. But that's not, I don't think that's quite the case you're talking about. That I wouldn't take a poem by Hans Magnus Enzensberger and say, actually, I think it'd be better if it was like this. I mean, I wouldn't dream of thinking that in the first place. But no, I mean, there are certain limits. Obviously, the living have something to say about the matter. To put it only like that. I'm trying to think of other examples. No.
Another question? Yes. Sorry, in the middle there. Thank you.
That was a wonderful lecture. Thank you very much for that. Do you speak any languages?
Aside from English, presumably.
Other than
I'm
English.
just reminded of an interview that I read with Kurt Vonnegut some years ago, where he said he'd just read an interview with himself and realised that English was not his first language. And, I can struggle along in German and French.
Does that help when you're translating?
Sorry?
Does that help when you're translating?
Well, yes, I mean, dictionaries and so on are very useful, and puzzling over the original as well. I mean, even if I don't have anything of the language, I'll always try and refer to the original text. I don't, by some kind of divination, which is probably completely intellectually bogus, you know, but you feel some kind of sympathy with the original.
Mm-hmm. You'd spoken, just as a follow-up to that question, you'd spoken about working with Daniel Hahn, my colleague, providing the literal. And how closely did you work with Danny on that?
Well, we went back and forth several times, trying to clarify things, you know, it was not so much a question of formal properties, just as sort of what is the lexical field of this word here in this line, you know. When he's referring to bread, what is he actually talking? Is he talking about bread, you know, or is it symbolic bread? Is it actual? Is it both? And so on.
Part of that's identifying that web of associations as well that you spoke about in your talk.
Yeah.
Sorry, I saw a hand right in the center of the row. If you can just wait for the microphone to be passed through. Oh, from this side. Here we are.
Won't be worth it when it arrives. The obvious question is, in a way, a follow-up to the first question you answered, is for a poet to be asked, what is your own experience of being translated into another language? And what do you demand of a translator? What would you want?
Well, I mean, my work is a bit translated into some other languages, and I'm in a position where I'm just pleased that they're doing it, really. I'm not going to argue about the fine print, as it were. An impression is, I'm very happy if an impression of my work is given in another language. It may be full of mistakes, I don't know. I mean, the best translation I've ever had of my work, somebody now dead, a very lovely old eccentric poet from Dundee called Arthur Foote, translated one of my poems into Esperanto. And it sounded infinitely better in Esperanto than it ever did in English. In English, it was sour, crabbed, spavined, miserable, satirical, nihilistic. In Esperanto, it sounded like, you know, a song of joy at the nature of the universe. And I preferred that to the original. He improved on it. You know?
Sometimes one does prefer the mistranslations over the translations. Another question.
Yes, please.
Right in the front. Here we are.
Thank you. Following up what you just said about the sound of your poem in Esperanto, and going back to an earlier question, when you're dealing with poems in a language you don't know, do you listen to the original poet in his own language, and does the music affect the way you translate it?
It would be difficult to listen to Dante. As far as I'm aware, he didn't leave any recordings. So I'm not being frivolous. I'm trying to think of examples. Most of the things I have translated have been from people who are historically remote. I've translated, I don't know if was Rilke recorded? I've translated a bit of Rilke, but I've never heard him reading it. I imagine that might be a rather mixed blessing, hearing Rilke reading it, perhaps. No, but I should. If I end up translating contemporary poetry, obviously, I want to hear. I only heard Corsino Fortes after the fact, and he does have the most beautiful voice, apart from just a physically beautiful voice, which kind of purrs over the language and makes you realise what you should have been doing. But it's too late by then.
There's another question in the front row. Yes.
I just wanted to ask you, what made you translate Corsino Fortes, if you could read
the
original?
The Poetry Translation Centre, a very fine organisation which concentrates obviously on translating poetry, is committed to bringing into English poems by poets from all over the world, especially people we haven't usually had a chance to hear. And he just sounded, in prospect, really interesting when I was asked if I was interested. I was completely ignorant of his work until that point, but I'm glad it was pointed out to me. So the opportunity, I was given the opportunity, for which I'm very grateful.
Thank you.
You invoked the name of Don Patterson as a colleague and an editor. I think, did you use the word terrorize or something like that? What I wanted to ask you was to what extent he was an inspiration to you, because I mean his work with Rilke. I believe I'm right in saying he doesn't know German.
Oh, I wouldn't like to say what Don Patterson doesn't know.
Well, I read somewhere at least that he amalgamated.
I think he probably
as a basis. Well, when I read the sonnets to Orpheus, I don't always recognise the Rilke, but they're always very interesting. I mean, he seems to have branched out now into Spanish as well. A Peruvian poet, Vallejo. Again, that's something. What you're saying, that it has to stand in its own right as a poem, and it certainly does. Somehow, the relationship to the original is secondary.
Yeah, perhaps it's a bit more like some of what went on in the Renaissance in terms of translation, where the translation was really an occasion for the imagination as much as it was an attempt to convey the original. So an impure approach, but an interesting one, I think.
A moment ago, you spoke about the possibility that you might have a chance to translate more contemporary poets. Is there poetry out there that you think, it would be lovely if I did have time and chance to work on something from or something by?
Well, I'm hoping to be involved with my colleague W.N. Herbert and Fiona Sampson. We hope to be doing something about Lithuanian poets, and I'm interested in the Lithuanian poet Cornelius Platelis, who has, to some degree, been translated into English. So I'm interested in that. But I quite like, it's like when somebody asks you to translate a play, it hasn't occurred to you to do it, but when somebody puts it to you, you think, well, that actually might be interesting. So anything interesting, anything legal considered.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Any other questions from the audience? Yes, there's one near the back. Thank you. Oh, this, yes.
Well, this one,
Yang
Lian.
Yes.
Hi, Sean. It was great to hear you. And, Walt Benjamin said the translation is not the original language, it's not only the target language. The translation is the third language. So since there will be the third layer between the original and target, and especially when you talk about the translation must be a good poetry, and therefore I feel you are not dealing only one identity as a poet, but actually deal with the two figures, one finally in between the original poet and actually yourself. And I'm really interested about this version of a final poem. Actually, it's half yours, but also half original, but also different from both of you. And is there any interesting or example of your translation concretely, and can tell us who is he?
Yang Lian's questions are always a little challenging.
That was quite a question, Yang Lian. I think your description at the beginning of there being three elements, the original, the target, and the third who walks with us always, as on the road to Emmaus, is a good one, yes, because you have to have something which takes on its own life. I'm not saying that's the only way to do things, but it's the way that interests me, that the thing becomes interesting for its own sake, but bearing in mind it would never have been there without the opportunity provided by the original.
I'm just noticing the time, and I think it's about time we bring the talk to a close. There are books, as you all know, in the lobby that you can purchase and take a look at. We're very excited to have some books by Sean out there, as well as those of the prize winners earlier this evening. And with that, I would like to ask everybody to please join with me for thanking our speaker tonight for the fantastic talk and for the wonderful discussion afterwards. Thank you, Sean.